So I think we got time for one more question, and this one I think makes sense for both of us to chime in on. So the question is from Greg's Medicine Cabinet. Uh, that's the name they provided. At various points, you guys have talked about creatine, magnesium, and snorting algae. Um, Memes and nightshades aside, and it has a comment here that I guess ashwagandha is a Himalayan yak shaving forum meme. I have no idea what any of those words mean.
I know what they all mean individually, but when you put them together, it loses all concept for me.
Yeah, apparently ashwagandha is both a meme and a nightshade, according to this user. The nature of the question is which supplements don't suck. So I'm going to start with the non-controversial ones, and we'll let the conversation evolve from there. So creatine's awesome. If you want to be strong, if you want to be muscular, creatine's pretty great. There was a recent meta-analysis that we covered in mass about creatine and fat loss, indicating that it might help with fat loss. I'm pretty unconvinced by the data suggesting that creatine might meaningfully boost fat loss. Maybe there's just the slightest, just razor thin effect, and that's okay. Like, we'll take it. But you don't take creatine for the fat loss. You take creatine for the power, the strength, the muscle gains. Interesting stuff coming out about creatine potentially favorably affecting bone and the brain. I think a lot of people aren't aware how important creatine is for the brain. Like, I mean, if you have a genetic defect as it pertains to brain creatine levels, it's catastrophic.
Oh, and if you're a vegetarian or vegan, I know we've touched on this before in a prior episode, but that was probably 3 or 4 months ago. If you're a vegetarian or vegan, like, I would recommend creatine to just about anyone, but I would a million times more recommend creatine to vegetarians or vegans. Like, virtually all of the dietary creatine you're going to get in is going to come from meat consumption. And so if you don't have meat in your diet, you're not going to be ingesting virtually any creatine in day-to-day life. And so in the studies that look at performance in omnivores versus vegans, vegetarians, with and without creatine supplementation, the boosts in performance are larger for vegetarians and vegans. And in studies that look at like mental performance, you give creatine to young, healthy omnivores, it generally doesn't affect mental performance. It may in the elderly, but that's another topic. But in like young, otherwise healthy vegetarians and vegans, creatine supplementation seems to improve mental performance and mood as well. So yeah, I mean, creatine is great for everyone, but especially if you're a vegetarian or vegan, find yourself a good vegetarian or vegan creatine supplement and use it. It's going to be doubly beneficial for you.
Yeah, definitely. The other one that's pretty non-controversial is protein. You don't need to supplement with protein, but you definitely want to make sure you have plenty in your diet, whether that's coming from food or from supplements. And when it comes to the protein supplements, as we've talked about, there are many, many, many options, and all seem to do a pretty good job as long as you're dosing them effectively. To me, those are the kind of two top-tier supplements that no one's really going to fight you on too much. But now we get into the second tier, specifically as it pertains to performance. My second tier supplements for performance purposes are caffeine, beta-alanine, citrulline malate, and sodium bicarbonate. The reason they're second tier is because their effects on performance are not quite as consistent in the literature and not quite as large when you compare them to something like creatine. There are plenty of studies indicating benefits for each of those four supplements. They each have some downsides, or at least some types of exercise where they don't do a lot. But generally speaking, if you're taking one of those for performance reasons, you could at least substantiate that claim with some really solid evidence. So caffeine, especially for endurance performance, is pretty reliable. Caffeine's pretty solid, but there's plenty of evidence suggesting it facilitates lifting performance as well. Citrulline malate, it's a mixed bag. The first few studies looked very promising. The last few that have come out have looked less promising. And so now I think the citrulline malate research is really at a crossroads. Are we going to start replicating a lot of those early findings, or are we going to find that the research starts turning the other way. But in any case, right now, the totality of the evidence would indicate that there is a small positive effect, particularly when it comes to things like repetitions to fatigue, strength endurance type outcomes. Now, beta-alanine and sodium bicarbonate, those are more applicable to performance that involves a high degree of acidosis. So things that are really pushing your anaerobic energy systems. The kind of classic way to think about it is if you're doing a 400, 800, 1200 meter sprint, those are like right in the sweet spot for anytime you're generating all of that lactate, all of that, all those protons, trying to buffer some of that acidity. That's where these supplements really shine. If you're a power lifter and you're doing sets of 3, you're probably not going to get a huge benefit from these two, especially if you have ample rest between sets. But still, there are some certain types of programs where they might have a place. Now, outside of that, there's really nothing I recommend for performance outside of extremely unique circumstances. Okay, but there are a few other supplements that I have bought in the past and do use from time to time. The 3 that come to mind for me are ashwagandha, tyrosine, and theanine.
Aren't you forgetting one? Trenbolone.
Ah, yes. We don't talk about that on the air. And copious amounts of marijuana that I pretend to hate just to keep people off of the trail, keep people off my scent. But yeah, so ashwagandha, there are some trials. They're not like the most rigorous, highest quality trials you've ever seen, but there are some lab-based trials indicating that ashwagandha supplement can be somewhat helpful when it comes to anxiety. And it is an adaptogen, so I think there's studies looking at physical exertion as well, right?
I don't know.
Well, you take it as well.
No, I do. I don't have anxiety issues. I'm pretty fucking chill.
I'm not at all.
That is completely true. But I feel even chiller when I take ashwagandha. And so, man, I'm just in it to vibe.
Yeah, I think there are some studies, not a large enough body of evidence that I'd call it conclusive, but I think there are some studies looking at responses to physical stressors as well as psychological that indicate some positive effects, slight changes in cortisol and testosterone levels, nothing to really write home about. But the ashwagandha, there's enough there, especially when it comes to some of the more psychologically oriented outcomes, to say like, okay, this is enough evidence to at least acknowledge it. Not conclusive, but and the other thing I always put a caveat there: anything in the realm of mental health or anything like that, always defer to a healthcare practitioner. If you think you have any kind of depressive or anxiety related symptoms, you see a physician about it right away. You don't say, I wonder if there's an herb I can lean on. You got to get professional help for that. Tyrosine and theanine tend to pair very well with caffeine. Greg and I are both just absolutely gripped by our caffeine addictions. No way out of it. No light at the end of that tunnel. We are completely hooked. But the cool thing is tyrosine a lot of times can potentiate the effects, some of the stimulatory effects of caffeine. And theanine, how would you describe what theanine does with caffeine?
Helps take the edge off.
Yeah, I mean, there's some evidence that theanine alone, people have promoted it as something to generally chill you out a little bit. And I know I've talked to some people that when they take theanine, they're like, I hate it because it makes me sleepy. I think it's kind of easy to conflate like the general, like the way it takes the edge off and just kind of takes you down a level in terms of like your amplitude. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, they feel that and they're like, I'm tired. But for me, I think theanine is a really nice, especially if you're taking a big dose of caffeine, you can get the enhanced alertness of caffeine without feeling like you're jittery and uncomfortably amped up. And so tyrosine and theanine tend to pair quite well with caffeine. Not a ton of lab-based research on that stuff, but they do tend to pair fairly well. Now you put a couple on the list here.
Well, I was actually wondering if you would like to mention the next one.
Yeah, so
it's more in your wheelhouse, I would say.
Correct. Yeah. So betaine. Betaine is found in beets. That's where it gets its name, but it's also found in spinach and some seafood and some whole grains and stuff like that. So betaine is commonly found in the food supply in various types of foods. And there have been some trials on using it as a supplement, and those human trials are really based off, it seems they're based off betaine's use in the livestock industry. For years, especially in pigs, I believe, they've used it as a food additive in the food of livestock to increase their muscularity and also to reduce their excess adiposity. And so if you go all the way back to, one of our first episodes, we had Dr. Jason Kaliva on to talk about his betaine research. And there's not a lot of it. There's not a lot of super relevant data with betaine, but it does find its way into a lot of pre-workout formulas. And there is some human evidence. If you're a Mass subscriber, coming up December 1st, in the December issue, I reviewed a brand new meta-analysis about betaine and its effects on fat loss. And it does look like in resistance-trained people that are training on a pretty sensible resistance training program, there might be some modest but measurable fat loss benefits. The effects on performance and lean mass are not quite as impressive, but it might be a somewhat helpful fat loss aid. Definitely need more data. We're going off very few studies on that, but there's something to it.
Okay, so the only three that I would add to that list for more like niche uses, well, I guess one isn't a niche use. It probably applies to about 25% of humans on the planet. But so one of them is taurine. So taurine, people believe a lot of weird shit about taurine. Like if I had a nickel for every time someone told me that taurine was extracted from bull semen, I'd probably have like $1.50, give or take. Like that's a reasonably common thing. It's not. The reason it's called taurine is because it was like first isolated from cows' stomachs, but has nothing to do with bull semen. But the reason I'd put taurine on there is if you are a bit of a partier, or if you smoke, or if you just generally have a lifestyle that is generally
badass.
I was going to say generally unconducive to health, but badass, yeah, that works. I don't know that there's good human evidence for this yet, but there is a very plausible mechanism and pretty decent rodent evidence. So taurine is one of the primary antioxidants in your brain, and it is the primary antioxidant in your testes if you're a male. And so if you drink a lot, or if you smoke cigarettes, or just, generally live a pretty rough and tumble, inflammation promoting lifestyle, that can both decrease brain function and also decrease testosterone production. And so again, in rodent models, supplementing with taurine while also drinking a lot, or I don't know how they do cigarette studies in mice, but they do somehow. I assume they don't roll up tiny little cigarettes for them, but whatever.
I think they do. I'd like to imagine they do.
That'd be cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, so in studies like that in mice, it seems to help preserve just general brain function and testicular function. So I don't drink nearly as much as I used to, but I did notice that like back when I did drink a little bit more, when I supplemented with taurine, I did just generally feel more vigor. So I don't know, maybe there was something to that. And man, so this was a question highlighted in blue. So I thought Trex was taking it. I didn't do pre-podcast reading. I'm going to throw something out there that I think is true. If it turns out to be wrong, don't crucify me for it. I want to say that there is also some evidence showing that in middle-aged males who don't live that hard drinking, smoking lifestyle, it can also increase testosterone levels a little bit. So that's not super relevant to me. But yeah, just in general, if you drink, if you smoke, may not be a bad idea to take taurine for half the population for your testes and for everyone for your brain and potentially liver as well. The next one I had on here was Rhodiola rosea. So Rhodiola is an adaptogen much like ashwagandha. Its benefits seem to be more related to like vigor promoting and anti-fatigue type stuff more so than being anxiolytic. So there is both pretty good animal and human research on rhodiola helping to mitigate mental stress and mental fatigue. So there is some performance literature on rhodiola now. It's a bit of a mixed bag. I'm not super sold on it, but as far as mental performance goes, if you are in a good mental state, like if you're well rested and not stressed out, it's probably not going to do that much for you. But if you're sleep deprived, if you're under a lot of stress, or if you're like trying to do something like deal with caffeine withdrawals or something like that, if you're a crazy person who doesn't want to use caffeine for some reason, rhodiola seems to improve both like mood, perceptions of energy and vigor, and objectively measured mental performance in situations where you are dealing with sleep deprivation or high stress. So that is one that I would recommend for situations like that. Not as good as a night of sleep, but if you can't get a night of sleep, rhodiola is probably going to help a little bit. And then the one that I said is probably relevant for about a quarter of the global population is Vitex agnus castus, or Vitex fruit. So this one's for the ladies. Vitex is super interesting, and it honestly shocks me that I don't see more people talking about it and more people taking it. So it has a couple mechanisms of action, but one of the things it does is it's a E2 receptor modulator, I'm pretty sure. But in terms of its actual effects, if you deal with really bad premenstrual or menstrual symptoms, or you deal with migraines associated with the menstrual cycle, Vitex seems to help considerably with that. So like decreasing severity of symptoms by like 30-40% if you take it daily for I think at least 2 months can reduce incidence of migraines associated with premenstrual and menstrual symptoms again by about 40-50%. Not a huge body of literature on it, but I want to say there's 3 or 4 studies now, and they've all found pretty similar results in terms of its ability to alleviate premenstrual and menstrual symptoms. So anyway, that is something that, if that is something you deal with, certainly a supplement worth looking into.